Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kivanga AB Wash Processed Kenya from Kaffa Oslo. And there's the bag right there. And again, I really like the look of their bags. But Kaffa, based out of Oslo, Norway. And this is our second ever full bag review of one of their coffees, having recently reviewed the Encantos del Coyote, a wash processed Peruvian coffee that I quite enjoyed. And that's been in line with all of my experiences with this coffee roaster, as I've quite enjoyed everything that I've had from them up to this point. But as I always like to say, you can tell a lot about a coffee roaster based off of their Kenyan coffee. So I'm looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 68. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Now in terms of roast profile for this one, they also have it listed as a light roast. And I would definitely say it was lighter than the previous coffee we had reviewed from them, but by no means an overly light coffee. So somewhere in that middle of the spectrum where it's a little bit more of a moderate light. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 46, first impression, and it came out very pretty right from the onset, as it skewed in the direction of the darker hard candy components that I very much enjoy in Kenyan coffees. That's typically what I look for, as opposed to the bright and savory aspects. There was a fair bit of brightness on the front end, however the cup just came out wonderfully clean and very sweet on the back end, making it a quite enjoyable first impression. Day 48. Ran it through the Chemex for the first time, and it wasn't quite as impressive as it had been through the V60, as it did seem to accentuate a lot more of the savory characteristics to it, in addition to the brightness present within the cup. There still was a little bit of the slight berry candied sweetness to the cup, but not to the same level. Didn't enjoy it as much on this second impression, so we continued on to day 50. Where I ran it through the April dripper for the first time, and it wasn't quite as good as that first impression with the V60. A little better than the Chemex, as this one radiated a lot more of those dark candy aspects present within the cup, with a complementary brightness throughout. And it was at this time I was getting a lot more of the citric component within this coffee. So I think it gave it a little bit more depth and character, and for that reason just made it a little bit more enjoyable, if not quite as much as the V60's first impression had been. Day 52, another Chemex day, as it does continue to skew a lot on the bright and savory side of things, as there's a lot of the vintage Kenyan attributes throughout, as there still remains a slight bit of the candied sweetness. It's solid, it's nice, but at the same time, it just doesn't necessarily offer the same sort of heightened sweetness that I had experienced from that V60. Ran it back through the V60, and again, I'm getting a lot more of the bright candied aspect yet again. The citric brightness is in equal measure, and I think that's kind of what I was going for in this coffee, was to maybe tone both of those things down, because there was a fair bit of brightness that was really kind of taking away from the candied component that I was really hoping to get significantly more of. So while they're both present, and it does heighten a little bit on the cool down, at the same time, I feel like it was just a little bit more bright than I was hoping for, so I was looking to find a way to maybe tone that down. Day 56, lowered to temperatures. That was the first adjustment I'd made, and it didn't have the same sort of vibrancy, as it felt slightly more muted with the V60. So I'm like, okay, well, I guess this isn't necessarily the way to go. A little bit more citric as well, so the trade-off wasn't necessarily worth it for me in that direction. But on day 58, I found the best cup of coffee I had had to that point, as I went with the more moderate temperatures at 95 degrees Celsius. And then found that the savoriness and the candied berry components were in about equal measure on the Chemex, but I was just getting a little bit more of the overall candied sweetness to the cup. That was the selling point for me, as this one came out so much more dark berry sweet, and it was worth the kind of brightness as well as the savoriness trade-off that I was getting from the cup. That, for that reason, it was my winner, and that's what I persisted with, as on day 60 continued with that recipe and found great sweetness as well as a bit of the reduction in the savory aspects. Wonderful clarity. Best clarity I experienced of this coffee to this point. Very candied forward with a citric aspect that was complementing that as well. Plenty of brown candy sweetness in the cup as well. A little bit of sugary sweetness. Just a pretty sweet cup of coffee in general. Very much what I was looking for Kenyan coffees. Definitely got it towards the end. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And there are a lot of level 4s. So we will start with the finished level 4. I always say the same thing when it comes to Kenyan coffees. Minimum, they're going to get a level 4. Definitely has a fair bit of that bright berry sweetness to the cup. In addition to that, the citric sweetness as well. Well, the citrus anyway. So that right there remains at that level 4. Not too much to say on that. Then we're going to go to the acidity level 4. Same thing with Kenyan coffees. Typically those two things as well as the berry are almost always going to reach a level 4. And of course they do. In this case, a fair bit of brightness. Not necessarily as bright as it could have been. I was working on toning that down, but towards the end, definitely at that level 4 mark. Berry, as mentioned, very much in line with the expectations for Kenyan coffees. A lot of those currants that they love, a little bit more of the tart berries. However, they came out a little bit more candied in this coffee, so for that reason, remains on the level 4 regardless. Citrus, level 4. Interestingly, it was in about as equal measure, and it was definitely a lot more of that tart citric as opposed to the more sweet citric component, which is fine by me. Given just how sweet the coffee was, I didn't mind having it be a little bit more of a tart citrus. And let's go ahead and discuss the other two level 4s, which I'm happy to discuss. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. I always say that if I can tone down the savoriness in a Kenyan coffee, then I can justify the level 4 for the clarity. And reaching level 4 clarity for a Kenyan coffee is always a nice selling point to me. So I really enjoyed that being there. Very clean cup of coffee for it being a Kenyan coffee. Sweetness, also at the level 4. I was able to get great candied sweetness from this coffee. I've been discussing that throughout this video as it was one of the more defining attributes in this coffee, especially when I could pull out much more of it. So really enjoyed the sweetness I was getting from it. Very much like it there at that level 4 mark. A couple of level 3s. We'll start with the florality level 3. That's pretty typical for Kenyan coffees for me, as well as oftentimes I get some of those kind of savory herbal floral components to it, as I like to describe as hibiscus. Didn't discuss it too much in here, probably on the lower side of level 3, but definitely some red florality experienced within this coffee. Body, well, actually we'll go to the caramel level 3. That's the sweetness, one of the most important things. It had that brown candied sweetness, and that sold me on this Kenyan because I really like when the Kenyan coffees have that sort of candied sweetness to them. Really happy with that there at that level 3 mark. Body at the level 3, even run through the Chemex, it still had a fair bit of body. Very typical for Kenyan coffees, so it has that kind of medium juicy body to it. And I'm quite happy with it there at that level 3 mark. And then probably the last thing we must discuss, and that is that savoriness at a level 2. Yes, it has a little bit of that Kenyan-like savoriness, that tomato-like component, but I did work through this coffee enough to the point where it was toned down and much more of a background characteristic as opposed to a defining factor within this coffee. So for that reason, it's at that level 2, and I'm very happy with it being at that level 2 because that's my least favorite part about Kenyan coffees. So at the end of the day, I like the way that this tasting looks. I think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This is actually one of my favorite Kenyan coffees that we've ever reviewed on this channel, and that is because the type of Kenyan coffees I prefer are the more sweeter candied Kenyan coffees in general, and this one had it in abundance, especially when I got this coffee right. There may have been a little bit of tinkering here and there to kind of figure out the best way to get that while toning down some of the slightly more smoky and savory aspects, but towards the end, when I got it right, I felt like it had a very nice sweet Kenyan component to it, and for that reason, it was my type of Kenyan coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, and that's usually the direction I steer people towards when it comes to these sort of Kenyan coffees, as it's not necessarily the overly traditional kind. I know some people don't experience the overly savory and acidic components, even with coffees that I deem to feel that way. So I would say that some traditional drinkers might see this as being a little bit more traditional of a Kenyan coffee because it still had the brightness, and I was working to really tone down that savoriness. But at the same time, it had great sweetness from the berry fruit. And I think that's what most Kenyan drinkers are actually looking for, is that a complementary citric component to it and just a slight bit of florality. So a lot of the characteristics you would associate with Kenyan coffees, but for me in a much more vibrant and pronounced manner. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kivanga AB Wash Process Kenya from Kaffa Oslo. Thank you for watching.